I mean, you mentioned that when people move to these practices, they end up having higher yields. They obviously are healthier themselves. They're producing more nutritious food. Is that not common known amongst the farmers? And if it is, then why isn't everyone doing it?
I guess it's not commonly known. You know, in a sense, it's that old. I don't know who came up with this phrase, but the future is already here. It's just not well distributed.
Right.
So at every level, regenerative agriculture suffers from a data problem,
Yeah.
a believability problem. You know, from the common trope that one would hear from a farmer at an agricultural conference is, "Oh, I saw it work for Bill, but it won't work for me on my land."
Right.
And those perceptions are going to remain until a critical mass has been developed. And if you take the Pareto principle or sort of marketing gurus, that's probably somewhere around the 13-15% mark.
Right. And where are we now?
Probably, I don't know. It depends. I honestly don't know where we are. We read very sort of different sort of points of reference on this data. But you know, one aspect of regenerative farming in the US, which is beginning to gain traction, is more rotational forms of grazing.
Sure.
So introducing longer rest periods into grazing platforms. I read one agronomist who's quite famous in our sector thinks that about 5% of small family farms in the US are now managed in that fashion. Now, I don't know whether to believe that or where that data emanates from. We do know that organic is probably less than 2%.
Yeah, I think it's
Wow.
exactly. But and then just in terms of giving the maths on the latest carbon cowboy study, which was 1,000 farms over most states in the US.
I think it was smaller than 1,000, but it was the longest study. It was a 10-year study.
And it was looking at the amount of carbon sequestered if effective AMP grazing is put into place, which is adaptive multi-pasture grazing, which means that you're trying to mimic the predator-prey relationship of livestock, such that they intensively graze an area for a very short period of time, stamp and pee and shit, and then move on, often for a year. And it allows, I suppose, an optimum amount of grass to be eaten to the right level whilst encouraging a root surge. And the figures are 12 tons of carbon per hectare.
Just to give some context to people that don't really know all this stuff, what you're speaking about is an integration. Is that just for meat production, or is that like integrating cattle into food crop production? So both in the same system, because from what I understand, at the moment it's completely separate. And the majority of farms, from what I've understood, are still factory farms. So it's very much cows just separated on massive lots that are just being fed soya, corn, things like that. And there's no grazing at all, even.
Well,
so what you're saying is not only grazing, which is, I assume, a small percentage, and now you're saying inside those grazing they should rotate. Is that correct? Or
I mean, there's a lot of generalities, and it's important to have generalities so that we all sort of know roughly what we're talking about.
Sure.
But there's also a lot of nuance that's left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
So if one takes the worst, most industrially produced beef that's, let's say, going into the McDonald's supply chain via these controlled animal feedlots in the Midwest that you're talking about, run by Cargill, etc., even that meat, the animals would have spent 50 to 60% of their lives on small family farms. And some of those small family farms would have raised those animals with good husbandry and good management of the land, others perhaps not so.
What, and then they sell them into the
Exactly.
after? Once
So
they're of a certain age? Or?
Once they get to a certain weight and age, those heifers will go to the feedlot to be fattened up on that corn and soy, which is that surplus of crops that's being grown within the food supply chain, often underwritten by both subsidies and crop insurance. So we've sort of created this monster for ourselves.
Yeah.
And you know, we're trapped into some of these industrialized systems. In the case of that meat production system, those highly intensive systems, they satisfy urban economics. i.e., the reason that those systems exist is because they need to slaughter animals at speed with economies of scale in order to deliver affordable meat to millions of people in city centres. So you can't really divorce, as soon as you start to talk about these things at a systems level, you can't really divorce the nature of food consumption and how cities aggregate food from rural areas from the controlled animal feedlots, from the grains and the soy that are used to fatten them up, which clearly makes them ill and is probably not good for us. But then you also can't separate the fact that it's actually a lot of rural farmers that are at the base of that supply chain as well.
So the demand is so high that it's necessary to maintain that system, because if you move to a regenerative way of doing it, it wouldn't create enough volume of meat.
Yeah, so let's say, so in it's partly, there's a geographical dimension to it. So in contrast to the American livestock sector, the UK one is in a far better state from a sustainable regenerative perspective. We don't have as many controlled animal feedlots. We do in our pig and our chicken and poultry and egg laying systems. They are definitely not sustainable and degenerative.
And that's most of them, right? That's the thing that, I think one huge thing I think of always is the image which people have of how a farm is, and the reality is so different.